Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. It is day 3 down our Russian rabbit hole with extra histories, the Cuban Missile Crisis Part 2. Let's get into it.
It's October 22nd, 7 p.m. Camera equipment clutters the Oval Office. 3, 2, 1. The president is live, announcing to 100 million Americans that there are nuclear weapons in Cuba. Around the world, troops are going on the alert. In Cuba, Castro sounds the mobilization, calling up 300,000 troops to defend the island. He dispatches Che Guevara to prepare for a guerrilla war. His brother Raul surrounds Guantanamo Bay with artillery. 100 miles away, in Florida, 120,000 servicemen gather in an invasion force nearly as large as the one deployed on D-Day. 600 aircraft clog the runways. Troops sleep in football stadiums. A cargo plane crashes on the tarmac at Guantanamo Bay. Its immolated crewmen are the first deaths in a conflict that could kill millions. In Moscow, the Presidium is buckling down for an all-night meeting. First, Khrushchev issues a statement calling this so-called quarantine an illegal act of piracy. He knows that the term's a rhetorical dodge. Kennedy can't call it a blockade because that would be an act of war. But illegal or not, Khrushchev orders his missile freighters to
And Kennedy using that terminology, using quarantine instead of a blockade, kind of symbolizes this whole thing. Both sides are trying to portray to the rest of the world that they are not the aggressors. In fact, the Soviet Union doesn't even imply or outright say that they have these weapons in Cuba. That becomes one of the kind of standoff points at the UN, is whether or not the Soviets actually have these warheads in Cuba at all. And so both sides do this kind of diplomatic and political jockeying to try to portray to the rest of the world that they are not the aggressors in this situation.
turn back toward the Soviet Union. He can't risk them being boarded. The other freighters, the ones delivering food and fuel, will continue on. Let Kennedy inspect those, it'll only embarrass him. Their submarine escorts will hold position just outside the quarantine, ready to move in case war breaks out. One freighter, Khrushchev decides, should steam on ahead as planned. Kennedy has delayed the quarantine a day in order to seek international support, and in that time, the freighter full of warheads can still make Cuba. It pulls into a rural port just before dawn. Soviet troops carefully unload its cargo and distribute it to the holding bunkers. Cuba's missiles now have teeth. At 12:05 p.m., 6 U.S. Navy jets take off from Florida, tearing over Cuba at 1,000 feet. They are low-level reconnaissance craft, meant to provide detailed pictures of the missile sites. On the ground below, Cuban anti-aircraft crews are unnerved and itching to strike back. Were those recon aircraft or strike fighters? Were their positions currently being marked for elimination? At 7:06 p.m., Kennedy officially signs the quarantine authorization, but there's a problem. XCOM is still debating how the Navy will enforce it. The Navy thinks it's simple. They will challenge every ship to stop for inspection. If the ship doesn't stop, they'll fire star shells. If it still doesn't respond, they'll disable its rudder and board it. If they encounter a submarine, they'll use practice depth charges to force it to surface. Hearing this, Kennedy goes white. Firing on Soviet ships could start a battle. A battle could lead to a war, and a war might mean nuclear annihilation. He dispatches the Secretary of Defense to keep watch over the Navy's war room. There must be no shooting. The Navy was treating this quarantine as if it was their objective to sink ships, but this operation should be meant to communicate with Khrushchev. This isn't whack-a-mole, it's sign language with destroyers. That night, Robert Kennedy sneaks into the side door of the Soviet embassy. It's a back channel that the Kennedys have used before. Robert asks if the Soviet ships will stop when challenged. The ambassador, uninformed about the missiles and with no orders from Moscow, says that they will not. And furthermore, stopping them will be an act of war.
So there's a lot of this during this crisis where, because you just heard Kennedy say that he's trying to communicate with Khrushchev using these naval destroyers, using the quarantine, there's a lot of miscommunication in the crisis that leads it right up to the brink of nuclear war. When it said earlier that Kennedy was afraid that a battle could start a war and a war could mean nuclear annihilation. The thought process is if a major battle breaks out anywhere, it is going to mean nuclear war. And so the idea isn't that, like, hey, don't shoot at these ships because it could start this like small conflict off of Cuba. It's that if you shoot at these ships, they could use their tactical nukes or their actual nuclear warheads from Cuba. They could go and take Berlin in Europe, and this immediately starts a major global conflict. And so that is the fear. And miscommunication back and forth the whole time gets you closer and closer and closer to that line when neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev really want that as an outcome. Neither one of them want war. They know what a battle or conflict will lead to. So they don't want it. However, like the military generals on the side of the US, there are people on both sides of this conflict who aren't Kennedy and aren't Khrushchev who are pushing for a conflict, who want this to happen, and they kind of hamstring their ability to maintain the peace throughout this and get very close to a nuclear disaster.
On October 24th at 10 a.m., the first suspected weapons freighter is scheduled to hit the quarantine line in minutes. XCOM anxiously waits for news. Then, a message. The Soviet missile freighters have turned back. We're eyeball to eyeball, says the Secretary of State, and I think the other fellow just blinked. Little do they know, there was no showdown. The freighters had turned back 30 hours ago.
Yeah.
CIA analysts wanted to be certain before passing on the information, and naval signals traffic is so busy right now, even emergency messages are taking 4 hours to get through. The closest Soviet weapons freighter halted 500 miles away from the interception point. But ships are still coming. In Omaha, Strategic Air Command orders the nuclear force to DEFCON 2. 145 missiles stand at the ready.
So let's say you have to read an incredibly long email from your boss that you have to finish before the
23 bombers circle outside Soviet airspace, each with enough firepower to level 4 cities. It's 5:15 in the Kremlin. Khrushchev has privately decided that there cannot, under any circumstances, be a war. But buckling to US pressure could destroy him politically. He needs to walk away from this with a win. He proposes a new strategy: withdraw the missiles in return for Kennedy's promise never to invade Cuba. The Presidium agrees to this. He drafts a letter outlining the deal and dispatches it to the US Embassy. It will take 8 hours to arrive. On October 25th at 5 p.m., the U.S. ambassador to the UN is famously quiet and careful, but Kennedy has made clear what needs to happen. The Soviets are still denying that the missiles exist. He has to go hard and hold their ambassador to account on television. "Do you deny that the USSR has placed missiles in Cuba?" asks the ambassador. "Yes or no?" Don't wait for the translation. Yes or no. "I am not in an American courtroom," argues the Soviet ambassador. The US will have their reply later. "I am prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over," the ambassador answers. He raises blown-up photographs of the missile sites and lays out his evidence. On October 26th, at 1 a.m. in Minnesota, a sentry guarding a radar station sees the silhouette of a man trying to climb the fence. He fires into the darkness and raises a sabotage alarm. It's happening. A Soviet commando raid. Pilots across the Midwest scramble into their cockpits. But the alarm is canceled just before the first takeoff. It's a false alarm. A bear had wandered into the wire. At 7:50 a.m., the U.S. Navy boards the first vessel passing the quarantine line. Now, this is a bit of political theater. Kennedy has purposely chosen a Lebanese freighter with a Greek crew for his first inspection. There is zero chance of it actually carrying nuclear weapons. But it does get the message across. Ships will be stopped. At 12 p.m., the CIA briefs XCOM. Low-level reconnaissance has discovered something new. Soviet cruise missiles, probably nuclear. They're positioned near Guantanamo Bay and the coast. Any U.S. invasion will probably be met with a tactical nuclear strike. U.S. generals ask for clearance to use their own tactical nukes. In Cuba, Castro's losing patience. He's annoyed that Khrushchev ordered the freighters to return, and furious that the Soviet ambassador's still denying the existence of missiles in Cuba. And most of all, he has had it with the reconnaissance flights. He's held fire so far to preserve diplomatic efforts, but his spies in the US are reporting that an attack may come as soon as tonight. These planes are violating Cuban sovereignty, scouting for an invasion, maybe even preparing for a surprise airstrike. He drafts a letter to the UN threatening defensive fire against any violation of Cuban airspace.
This kind of stuff makes it to where the Soviet Union just almost totally disregards Castro after this crisis. His actions in it are seen as so irrational and so childish, I guess, that Khrushchev is like, nope, not doing it. Remember, Khrushchev is trying to prevent a nuclear war. The last thing he wants is some third party who, in the mind of the world, is on Khrushchev's side to come in and start shooting down airplanes or, precipitate a major war just because he's acting irrationally and doesn't want to let any diplomacy happen. And so it really, really affects not just Castro's, but Cuba's influence on the world stage from here on.
At 6 p.m., Khrushchev's proposed deal finally arrives at the White House. The letter is long and rambling, which is why it took so long to translate, encrypt, and send. It pleads against a war. Kennedy wants to take this deal, but the press, stonewalled by the White House and seizing on statements by a bureaucrat, is reporting that an invasion of Cuba is imminent. If the Soviets believe them...
I believe that the training exercises that the military was doing down by Florida was called ORTSAC. I think that's what initially kind of starts this idea that it's Cuba and Castro and it's for an invasion, is because the name of the training exercise is ORTSAC, which ironically is Castro spelled backwards.
War may break out before he can accept. On October 27th at 6 a.m., Castro has been at the Soviet embassy all night, trying to draft a statement. He thinks that the US will invade at any moment, and that will inevitably trigger nuclear war. But he keeps vacillating on what he wants Khrushchev to do about it. Finally, the frustrated ambassador asks, "Are you recommending a first strike? Yes or no?" "Yes," he says. In the event of a US invasion, the USSR must launch. Cuba will be martyred, but the global revolution will survive. Meanwhile, in the White House, Kennedy is ordering more recon flights, despite Castro's warning. CIA reports indicate that the missiles are now operational. If one launches, it will hit New York or Washington in 10 minutes. There is zero room for error. One slip might mean the end of humanity. At 11:16 a.m., Soviet troops pick up a high-altitude plane over Cuba. It's probably a U-2, and it's been photographing their positions in depth for an hour. Their surface-to-air missiles can knock it out, and their general has issued orders to shoot down airspace violators. They call him for confirmation, but he's asleep. So they launch. 72,000 feet above, Major Anderson is listening to his U-2's camera traversing back and forth. Thunk, 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 thunk. Then, a warning siren. An indicator goes red. He tries to evade, the fragile plane creaking as he banks. Then, there's an explosion. Shrapnel rattles through the fuselage. Helmet glass shatters, and then, depressurized silence. Debris falls on the green fields of Cuba. And now, it is a shooting war.
All right, that was Extra History's The Cuban Missile Crisis Part 2. I will get to Part 3 probably later today, if not tomorrow. Like, comment, subscribe. I am Race of History. Until next time, I'll see you guys later.